Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you for joining our webcast. My name is Carlos Cardozo. I have here with me Fernando Zambrotti.
Hello, everyone.
Fernando works with me at ActMinds, which is a Microsoft partner, which is in the market for over 30 years. And we are focused on developing custom software and solutions. We're here today to talk a little bit about load performance testing. I wanted to start with a very important question. Are you able to tell today how much load your application will actually support in production? Most companies don't. And this is a critical thing because you have on the market today applications or services that can monitor your application, that can tell you when something goes wrong, but you don't want to get in that position when it happens. You want to know it before it happens, right? When your application starts to not be as performant, not give it as speedy responses to your users, wouldn't it be nice if you could know how many users you could support with a good experience on your product when it's out there in production? We're going to show a little example of how to load and go through a performance evaluation of your application using Visual Studio and Azure. It's important to mention the difference between load and stress test. There's a lot of buzz in the internet. People talk about loading and stress testing your application. Stress testing is something that it's a kind of load test that you keep increasing and increasing the number of users until you reach that limit and your application just start to not respond, right? Just returns 500s, the responses are take an acceptable time to return to the user. So this is what we call the stress test, is find the limit when your application is no longer usable. And a load test is pretty much the same thing, but you know how far you want to go, so you can monitor your application on the back end and try to understand a little bit how it behaves under certain load. But why is it important? I know nobody likes to have a web application that users say that, oh, this is too slow, it takes a while to work, but it's not just a comfort for the end user. There's more to that, right, Fernando?
Applications performance is something that may hurt your business really bad if you don't take care of it. Talk from a business perspective. Some of our clients, for instance, they own a digital product they sell as a service. They work with a subscription business model. So for them, bad performance means customer churn. I'm sure we're all familiar with the term, but just in case, churn means the rate of customers that leave you during a given time. So if you're not providing good user engagement from a perspective point of view, you're going to lose your customer. They're going to go to your competition. They're going to search for an alternative of your tool, of your product, because they're not happy and satisfied with the loading time of your page. So we don't really usually link the two things, but it's very, very important to take care of it. And it's not just me talking it. Carlos is showing on his screen this info chart from Kissmetrics. They have published and provided us some very good insights on how loading time affects your bottom line. It's how they call it. The chart they published it shows as your page load time increases in seconds, it also increases the rate of users that abandon your web page because they move out of your application. They go to your competition. It's showing from an e-commerce website, it's showing how performance affects the shopping behavior. If we take a look at this first chart, it's telling that 47% of the customers expect a web page to load in 2 seconds or less. And then if we take a look at the next one, it says 4% of the users abandon the website that takes more than 3 seconds to load, for instance. So there's a lot of insights that shows us how important it is to take care of the loading time of your website, of your product, or in order to reduce customer churn, in order to improve your conversion and traffic metrics, if you're talking about a public website, for instance. And I'd also like to share one example. So there is this university that we've had a pleasure to work with, and they provide a range of distance courses based on one e-learning platform they were hosting on premises. At some point, with the increase of the number of students they were handling, they started to have issues with the platform. So basically, during most of the day, the platform could handle the user activity really well, such as users logging in, downloading files, and chatting, and watching videos and everything. But during the night, they noticed that the amount of simultaneous users connected to the platform increases a lot. This is a common behavior of e-learning students. Most of them are in the office during the day, and the only time they have to study and do class activities is during the night. So business schools started to have problems and started to lose students because they were not happy with the performance of the e-learning platform. We started working with them and helping them move this platform to the cloud, and I'm talking about Windows Azure here, basically to leverage and take advantage of scalability. During this project, we did an extensive load and performance evaluation in both environments they had, on premises and also in the cloud, to make sure of, A, we were providing a better user experience from a performance point of view, and B, that the platform was able to auto-scale. So during the night, the environment scales and provides a better performance for users, for a huge amount of users that they have during the night. Okay, Carlos?
Yep, thank you. So when we say that, wow, the application is not behaving correctly, the users are having issues, is this some kind of development team's fault? Is this an issue that they didn't test it correctly? They didn't implement that much of unit testing, integration testing, QAs were sloppy and didn't do a good job? Not exactly. This is a scenario where it's very complicated or difficult to reproduce on-premises environments. So even though you tested all the scenarios, you know all your components work correctly, they work smoothly when they're plugged in together, you can't predict what's going to happen with a database when you have 100 users or 1,000 users. This is the kind of scenario it's an additional safety net that we add to our application from a performance standpoint, right? This is what we call the performance improvement flow. We use Visual Studio and Azure to simulate an amount of users on our application, and of course, you can run those scenarios from your local machine and try to generate load in your application, but it's not the same thing. Your machine has limitations. There are other bottlenecks that you need more hardware and all this stuff that's costly to build all this infrastructure just to test one application. So that's why we use Azure. So the difference in this scenario is in using stress tests and running load tests is that with load tests, you can simulate a specific number of users. And then with that load on your application, you can jump to step number 2, which is analyze what's going on with the backend of your application. So at this point, you're looking how your database is behaving, how your application is using cache or using memory or CPU, trying to find bottlenecks or improvement points where the application can be tweaked to perform better under that specific circumstances. The next step on that process would be, once you identify that, use a agile development process to make sure that you know exactly what to improve and focus on how to get better performance for your application. So this is where you're going to develop or implement the new functionality or the improvements to your application. And then, as a bonus, is the continuous performance validation. So once you wrote all those scenarios to be executed as load and performance evaluation, you can also run those, make sure that everything that was working is still working. You can use those tests as regression tests. And you can have that plugged in your continuous integration infrastructure. So you can create environments on Azure and run those tests once you have a new release or a new feature before moving that to production. Azure can also let us simulate other variables that we might need to generate for testing our application correctly and be the closest to the real world scenarios. For example, you can have users from North America, from Africa, from Europe, wherever Azure has a data center, which is a lot of places right now. You can have this distribution across these different locations to simulate how the experience from a user in Africa will be on my application that's currently hosted in the United States, right? There are other things you can vary, like you can simulate different scenarios and a mix of those scenarios. Let's say you're testing a update to one of your user profiles, but at the same time you might have users running a different scenario, like listing all the products you have on this e-commerce application. So when you look to one of those scenarios, it works perfectly. But when you have users running both scenarios at the same time, you may find concurrency issues on database or in the application, and this is one of the good things that we can use the load and stress solutions from Visual Studio. One more thing that's very, very common these days is having users that you never know which platform they're using, right? So you can choose the number of users running Google Chrome and how many users are accessing your application using Internet Explorer or Edge or from a mobile phone. So all of these different variables get together that you can play and tweak with them to make sure you can get the closest to a real interaction with real users on your application.
Hey, Carlos?
Yep.
So just wanted to remember, we're going to be showing that in a few minutes, right? We're going to be doing how to create a load test and how to run that on the cloud.
All right. So since you already gave them the spoiler, I think it's time for us to run a quick load project. And for that, we created a very simple application just to demonstrate a little bit how the dynamic would be for creating load and stress tests.
I'm going to show you the application we're going to be load testing. As you can see, this is a very, very simple application we created just to be able to demonstrate how to create a load test, how to create the scripts. We're not really focused on talking about the best way to load test your application. Maybe we're going to be talking about that in next webinar. But in this case, we're just showing you how to create the scripts and get started on load testing your own applications. We've created an additional page here. I'm going to click on it, so let me just go through. So here we have created a logic to give you the number prime based on one position. So if I submit in this form field number 1, for instance, and click find, it's going to tell that the first prime number is number 2. And then if I choose different numbers, it's going to do the calculation and return me that specific prime number. This is a very simple logic we created in order to do some sort of a CPU processing. As we increase this number, it increases the CPU processing necessary to be able to give me the prime number. So that's an easy and good way to show you how we can really put the application to the test and force it to the limit and maybe reach the stress condition with a load test.
Right. And I think it's worth to mention that this deployed on Azure, but for the purpose of this presentation, we have disabled everything that's related to scaling and everything, so we can easily get to a point where the application gets stressed and we see those results on Visual Studio.
Yes, this is really important. As you see here, I'm on Windows Azure Management Panel. We have the application here, and just like Carlos said, it's a very small instance we created, and it's not going to auto-scale, okay? At the same time, we have also configured Application Insights, which is a very nice feature from Windows Azure. It gives you a live stream of how your application is poured in the load. We can take a look at that as we run the load test. I'll try to show you that. And it gives us actionable insights on help you pinpoint your bottleneck. So this is really, really nice. And also, this next step here, I have Visual Studio Team Services panel loading, and I'm also going to show you how we can take a look at the history, past runs that we did, and compare some different load runs so we can really see whether or not our application is improving. Okay, let me go back to Visual Studio. As you can see that, so I have here Visual Studio. It's pretty simple process. I'm going to click New Project. On my left side, I'm going to choose Test Templates. And then I have available here Web Performance and Load Test Project. So I'm going to just go ahead and click OK and create this project. Visual Studio already creates for me an empty web test script from which we can create our own web test. So the first step is we will create a scenario simulating one user connecting into our application and actually doing something within our application. So in this case, we're going to navigate through the application and submit a number on that form field that I just showed you. We're just going to create one web test. If we're talking about like a different application, let's say we're talking about an e-commerce, we could think about different scenarios. So maybe create one test for a user logging in, another web test for a user searching for a specific product within our website, or adding a product into my shopping cart, for instance. So we can think about different scenarios to create. In this case, I'm just going to create the very simple one. So here in the web test toolbar, I can click Add Recording. So as you can see, it opens up Internet Explorer, which I can use to, just like a user of my application, navigate, and it's going to be recording every step that I take into my application. So let me copy the URL. And let's navigate. As you can see, it already recorded one step here. So I'm going to click on a menu item. I'm going to submit number 1, hit find. Okay, so I already have the result. You can see here on the left-hand side all of the steps it recorded. So I can right now just click stop, since this is a very, very simple scenario we are creating here.
Right.
Visual Studio now is going to do some working on top of that to detect some parameters and stuff. And then from this panel here, we can do pretty much whatever we want with this script. We can create validation rules. We can increase additional steps into this test. So you can choose to export this into a C# class library, for instance. But in this case, I'm just going to go ahead with this very simple scenario we created, just the way it recorded for us, okay? As you can see, if we expand here, we see all the header information. We can see also the form post parameter, in this case, the number 1 that I provided to the application in order to do the calculation. So, you know, it's all here. We can click Run Test just to see whether or not this is working. So it's running, loading the tests. We can see our application here in the bottom panel, and it already gave me the result. So it passed it, which it worked fine. In this case, we're not actually putting loading on top of our application. We're just running as one single user doing some action in our website. Just wanted to make sure it was working fine. But in this case, since we're going to be running with a lot of simultaneous users, I don't want to really have all of the users submitting number 1 in my application. You know, this is not kind of the default behavior of our regular user in our website. So I want to use something different. I want to connect this into a different data source. So I'm going to use random numbers, you know, something like that. So in this case, I have here on my machine a CSV file. Let me add it and show you. So I have a few different numbers here we're going to be using on our test instead of just using number 1 and having it hard-coded, okay? So let me copy this path to the file. It's going to be helpful. Okay, so I'm back to Visual Studio. I'm going to click on Properties, and on the place where I have the value 1, I can just click Add Data Source. It shows me some options here. I can plug into a database, an XML file, and a CSV file, which is this case. I'm going to hit Next and choose the file that I want. So you can see it loaded my CSV file. I can click Finish. Okay, so it created a data source. Actually, it didn't really change here the number 1. Yeah, so now I can just go back here and actually say, okay, use this data source instead of using number 1. Okay, so let me go ahead just to make sure it is working. I'm going to run this test again. Still no load, no, you know, just one single user. We see it's still running the last step of our test, which is submitting the information, and it's taking longer because it's probably using a different number instead of 1.
And this is what Fernando just did, is what we call the data variation configuration. So we can try to create, for example, like he did, just a CSV file with a bunch of numbers, but we could have other kinds of inputs. We could have written logic to generate numbers. We could have attached it to a database and read data from a table in a database to serve as a data source for this input parameter.
Yes, that's correct. And also, like I said, this is a very simple scenario. Carlos was saying we can actually write a logic in order to use different values. We can also load test an API endpoint. This is actually, nowadays, it's very common to build an API endpoint for your application. So we also can use this same set of tools in order to test that instead of just testing your web front end. Okay. All right. So it's working fine. We can now go ahead and actually create the load test we want to run. So on my project, I'm going to right-click and hit Add, and then I'm going to create a new item. So I'm going to choose Test again from the template list, and I'm going to choose Load Test. So Visual Studio opens up a wizard that we're going to be using to set up how we want it to run our load test. And the first thing that we have to tell Visual Studio is if I want to run this load test on my own machine, on my own laptop computer, which is the on-premise option, or I can choose to run that on the cloud. So in this case, and the subject of this webinar is to really show you how to run that on the cloud, which is, a better option since my laptop computer is not very powerful. I'm not going to be able to generate a huge amount of simultaneous users, okay?
Yep. And notice that for this to work, you need a valid Microsoft subscription, and you have to be connected to this Visual Studio or Team Services, right, on the cloud, online.
Yes. You can see on this box here, it's grayed out because I already have my own account selected. And then if it's the first time you're running, it's going to ask you to provide the credentials, okay? It's very straightforward. So I'm going to click Next. And then Carlos talked about it. We can use different Azure data centers to run our load test. In this case, I'm going to keep default one, but then you can choose to run that from Europe or from Brazil or India, wherever you want to run your tests from. Okay. Then I'm going to hit Next again. So now we actually start configuring the behavior of our load test. So in this case, I'm going to select for how long I want to be load testing our application. Let's have like for 4 minutes, since we're just doing this very simple example. And then we can also set a warm-up duration. I'm going to set 1 minute. And this is warm-up duration is important because let's say nobody's accessing your web application, and whenever you first access it, some services have to start up, okay? And then the first access takes a little bit longer than the next ones. So that's one of the reasons we use warm-up period, okay? So your results is not going to be affected by that.
Right. Imagine you just deployed something. You've got new assemblies on your file. You just pushed a new website. So the very first thing we do as developers to make sure we have the latest thing, we open up a command prompt and run a IIS reset from command line, right? And then we reset everything. So we can ensure that the new assemblies are running. So this process, the first request will pay the price for loading everything and maybe making sure that database connections are open, all the assemblies that are required to run a specific operation are loaded in memory and everything. So this is why we do the warm-up. We want to make sure that users that come to our application, the cache is correctly filled with information and they're not starting from scratch, right?
Yes, very important. All right, so I'm going to hit Next again. And then it asks me about the think time. So remember when we were accessing our application and browsing and clicking on different links, and Visual Studio was recording my action. So it was also recording the time that it took me from between different clicks, okay? And it's actually, it's what they call think time, because a user is not going to just clicking through different links on your application. They're going to open a page and read some information, look at some graphic information, and then click again on different links. So we can choose here to use the recorded think time. We can also choose not to use the think time. And there's this option in the middle here, which is the one that I'm going to use, which is Visual Studio will run a normal distribution algorithm based on the recorded think time, and that's the one we want to go in this scenario.
Yeah, this is another feature that helps you create scenarios that are closer to real user interaction.
Yes.
Instead of just shooting a lot of requests to your API, you can pretend that the machine that's running the test is actual users that read the page and make decisions. Should I click this button? Should I go to the other direction? And this is what the think time means.
Yes. All right. So if I click next again, then I can choose to run my entire test with one specific load of simultaneous users. In this case, it's preset to 25 simultaneous users. Or I can choose to do the step load. So between each 10 seconds, for instance, it's going to increase the amount of simultaneous users that we have connected into our application. So then we can choose the start user count, the step duration, the step user count, and then the maximum simultaneous users that you want to have with your test. Okay, so I'm going to do a step load. I'm going to start with 10 users, and each 30 seconds I'm going to increase this number of users by 10, and then my maximum user count is going to be 200. Okay, it's just an example, and then you can tweak that as you wish and as it makes sense for your entire scenario. Okay. If I hit next again, it asks me about the test mix. So in this case, we just created one test scenario, which is browsing through the application and submitting the information on the form to get the prime number. But like I said, if we're talking about like the example that I gave you about the e-commerce, we would have 3 or 4 different scenarios. So this is the step where we tell Visual Studio how they're going to be, how it's going to be working with this test mix. Okay.
Right. In the case of the e-commerce scenario, one user could be searching for umbrellas, for example, and the other user might be checking out on the cart. And you have these 2 scenarios happening at the same time, and you want to make sure that your application still works correctly for each user, even though there are other users consuming other resources of your application.
Yes, that's correct. That's it. So I'm going to hit next again, and then it asks me to add all of the test scenarios that I want to run. In this case, that's just the one we created. Okay, I'm going to hit next again. And then Carlos talked about it a few minutes ago. We can choose the browser from which users are going to be connected in our application. So I'm going to keep Internet Explorer, for instance, and I'm going to add Google Chrome, and then I can set up the distribution that I want to keep on across the users. So that's when it's important for you to know your user behavior. Okay, so you can take a look at some analytics information and see, well, 75% of my users uses Google Chrome, so let's try to simulate and do the same here on our load test. Okay, so then I can just click Finish, and it's done. We have already created our own load test and our test scenario. So it's all set up. It's already configured to run on the cloud. So now it's just a matter of clicking here, Run Load Test. And as I do it, Visual Studio starts uploading the files, provisioning the resources on the cloud, and doing whatever it needs to do before it really starts running. It usually takes from a few seconds into a few minutes to really get started. Okay, so let's take a look at it. And as it starts,
it all depends on the number of scenarios, number of users. You have selected distribution of different browsers or whatever. So
yes. And as it starts provisioning the services, I'm gonna go back to my browser, click on the Windows Azure Management Panel, and then I'm gonna click on the Application Insights resource that I have configured here. Let's see if we can see that in action. So like I said, we have an option here called Live Stream, and then you see that in real time how your application is handling all of the requests. So let's see how it goes.
Fingers crossed here.
Yes, so that you can see there's a lot of information you can see here. It's very helpful. Let me switch back to Visual Studio, see whether or not it started. Okay, it's running the warm-up period for a minute. Try to keep that on the same screen. And like I said, this is a very small instance from Windows Azure. It's not going to scale up, so we're probably going to see some failed requests. It's not going to handle very well the load. Okay.
Yeah, any amount of users will hurt this application.
Yes. And then you can see like request duration, requests per second, whether or not we have failing requests, and there's a lot of information. You can also see after we run this test, you can see and browse and search for errors and try to figure out why it happened. Okay, so there's a lot of important things you can do here. But let's go back to Visual Studio, which is our focus right now. So it already started running our load test. It's going to run for 4 minutes. We have already 31 seconds of this load test. And from each 15 seconds, it's going to show us on the chart how it's handling. And here we have some things we might want to take a look at, like average page time, average test time, the average response time, user load, and processor time. And there's a lot of additional information you can also see after we finish the load test. You can export this result to a spreadsheet, and you can also try to plug into Power BI and do some analysis on top of this data. So there's a lot of different things you can do with it, and a lot of actionable insights to really get you on a way of figuring out what's going on with your application and really figuring out whether or not you have a performance problem. Okay. So let's see how it goes in this case.
And it's important to mention, just to make sure that we are on the same page, when we look at Visual Studio, we're looking at the application from the outside. This is how your customers will be interacting with your application. And when Fernando switched back to that Azure pane on the browser, that's our backend analysis. So he went to Azure and he's looking to how the application is behaving behind the scenes. Right.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So,
like I said, I mean, this is not going to give us very good insights on the performance because we're using a very small website, a very short test. Okay, so and our goal here is really showing you how you can use Microsoft tools to start working on your own load tests and testing your own application. Okay, so it's really to help you get started on that. And I'm sure in the short future we're going to be hosting webinars to really go a little deeper and try to understand what's going on with the application and figure that out. Okay?
Hey, Fernando, we got a question here.
All right, go ahead.
Well, the comment is, we're running this application on Microsoft Azure, but what if it's a Java application hosted in AWS, for example? Would that make any difference?
Okay, no, it would not make any difference in this case. Okay, we're just, as you saw, we created a test scenario just browsing through the application on the browser. So no matter if this is a PHP application or Java application, whether or not it's running on Azure or on your own machine on premises, it doesn't make a difference in this case. Okay, for this test, we're just pointing to the website or to the API endpoint and doing the test. Okay, so we're not digging into and adding some telemetry into the application or something like that. The only thing that it would not be able to do is to use the Windows Azure Application Insights feature, because this is some sort of a backend telemetry that we already have configured on our website since it's hosted on Windows Azure. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So in that case, with the Java application on AWS, you're going to be using something that Amazon offers that is equivalent to this insights you're seeing.
Yes. Yes. For instance. So it's finishing our load test. It's collecting the results. After we finish, there's a lot of, like I said, we have the download report here button. We can download the information, all of the files it created. We can dig a little deeper into all of the charts. For instance, here, this line here of the chart, I can see the user load. As it increased, I reached 80 simultaneous users during the period of load test we had. The orange line is the average page response time, which really peaked here in the beginning, and then as we started to see some failed requests, it reduced a lot. Then we had a spike again, and then it started increasing at a higher progression here. But then we're not really analyzing information right now. This is not the focus. We just want to show you how you can use the set of tools and how easy it is for you to really get started and putting some load on your application and be able to answer that Carlos question, right? So can your application handle the load of success? So this is the goal here. Let me switch back to the Google Chrome, where I have Visual Studio Team Services open here. So I'm going to click on the load test section. I want to show you something neat. So we can see the last two load tests that we did today, and I'm going to select a different period. So let me show all of the previous tests that I did here, and I'm going to select two previous runs so I can compare different runs. So let's say you already have all of your test scenarios created, all of your load tests is configured, so it's all working fine. It's just like the way you want it. And then you keep working on your application. You keep building and deploying new features or bug fixes and things like that. So you want to make sure that from each deployment you're not degrading the performance, right? So then you can use this set of tools and you can really compare different runs so you can see how your application is behaving. So in this case, the second run was we had a worst result. So this is just an example we see from the previous one, and then the second run. Let's say the average response time the first time was 1.2 seconds, and then it dropped to 7.7 seconds. So there's something wrong here. So just like to give you some information, and there's a lot of things you can do here. You can browse across all different pages and see charts, create our own charts, and export the results and plug into Power BI. So there's a lot you can do here with this set of tools we showed you. So basically what we were using is Visual Studio to create the scripts to run the load test. We were also using Azure, in this case, to host our application, which is not necessary for this scenario. Just like the question, like you can be using AWS or something like that. And then we were also using Visual Studio Team Services, which works with Windows Azure to run your load test. Okay, Carlos?
Yes, and this kind of report is nice because you can tell that something you did might work or might not work when it goes to production, right? So maybe you tried a different approach to solve the problem, which actually made it even worse. So you can see this before you push your application to production. And this is another thing, I think it's a cool feature that you get, or benefit that you get from working with the cloud environments, that you can replicate that environment. And you can create a QA on the cloud or a UAT or whatever you call it, and you can run those tests on that separate scenario, environment that actually mimics what you have in production. So you don't have to deploy it to production and affect users to make sure that everything is right, and in case you have to roll everything back if it gets worse, like in this case. So you can just get rid of that environment and build a new one once you have new features or new improvements in place. Does anyone else have any questions or any comments?
We actually have an additional question here. He's asking, he's saying that he have a storefront website and they have thousands of users accessing it in a single second. So can he simulate it? The answer is yes. In this case, the example that I showed you, we used like 10, 20, 80 simultaneous users, but you can increase that number to 1,000 and 10,000 simultaneous users as you wish, and really based on your scenario. Like if you know the behavior of your application, the amount of users you're expecting to have, or an increase of the users that you have on your application, then you can try to simulate that as close as possible.
All right, and do you have anything else, Fernando?
No, that's it so far.
All right. I would like to thank you all. Feel free to reach out if you have any other questions that might come up later and you still need it answered. Thank you. Have a good one, and thanks for joining our webinar.